Our next keynote speaker of the morning, I'm really thrilled to introduce. Lindsay and her work have influenced me actually even before I knew of Responsive Org, though we had not met in person prior to this morning. Just so I have a frame of reference, and maybe for you as well, how many folks here have read Lindsay's book, Primed to Perform? Okay, interesting to note. I actually am excited by the rest of them because how much you have to learn. It's a really exciting book. It's a lot of really interesting research. I, in my undergraduate, studied research psychology. And one of the things I really appreciate about Lindsay is that she takes research on human behavior and organization theory and makes it very applicable and very successfully implemented for each of us in our own organizations and in our own lives. So Lindsay is the co-author of Primed to Perform, a New York Times bestseller, and the co-founder of Vega Factor, which is a startup that creates technologies to help organizations succeed. So without any further ado, Lindsay, welcome. Standing ovation for Lindsay.
Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? All right. We're going to dive right in. I would like to see, by show of hands, how many of you have ever tried to get a child to do something using bribery? Bribery? Lots of bribery going on in this audience. All right. We're going to look at an experiment that was done to see how do we make children more helpful. In the middle of the room, you're going to see a toddler who's going to play with a toy that lights up and makes music and is toddler heaven. And over here in the corner, behind a desk, is going to be a research assistant who's a complete stranger to the toddler. She's going to be folding some papers when she's going to accidentally drop something over the edge of the table. And then we want to see what percentage of the toddlers are going to leave the really fun toy to help the stranger. So I'm going to ask for show of hands again. Who thinks that more than 50% of the toddlers help? Who thinks that less than 50% of the toddlers help? You've got a lot of child haters here today, Robin. All right, let's take a look at what actually happens. It's adorable, right? Nearly every single toddler does that. Nearly everyone. But it wasn't the point of the experiment. The point of the experiment was to see how do we make toddlers even more helpful. So they took all the helpful toddlers and divided them into 3 groups for training. This group over here at the side of the room, you'll be my control group. You'll do the same thing you just saw over and over and over again. Middle group. You will receive verbal praise every time you help to show how much we really appreciate your behavior. And this group over here will receive electric shocks. I'm kidding, no shocks. You will receive a little toy, a toddler bonus reward to show how much we really appreciate your helping behavior. Then we want to see how much more helpful is the reward group and the praise group from the control. Let's take a look. The control group, doing the same thing over and over again, keeps helping 89% of the time. The praise group keeps helping 81% of the time. And our reward group keeps helping 53% of the time. Right? This is the exact opposite of what many of us are taught in our business schools and our organizations. Just for fun, I want to show you a video of a toddler who used to be helpful and then was trained using rewards.
Yeah. Na sowas. Na sowas. Der Ball. Der Ball. Der Ball.
Do you have any colleagues like that? What this experiment and many more teach us is that human performance is much more complicated than meets the eye. And to really unpack what's going on here, and in our highest performing organizations, we have to ask 3 questions. The first is, what do we mean by performance? The second is, how do we create it? And the third is, how do you create an entire culture around that? which is what we're going to talk about today. Our first big breakthrough in trying to understand what created the highest performing cultures came from defining performance. For a long time, all of the psychology and business practice that we read was really contradictory. One research paper said, use purpose and joy, and the next said, beat people over the head and they'll do what you say. It was very contradictory until we realized that there were actually two types of performance. The first is tactical performance, and this is how well you execute the plan. But the second is adaptive performance, and this is how well you diverge from the plan. Think about it. Imagine all of us as business leaders, we're in charge of setting up a call center. Maybe we're selling circus tickets, right? We're going to estimate how many people are going to go to the circus, how many people do we need to have in our call center, what's the average time for every phone call, we'll build a big Excel model. We'd have process maps and flowcharts, we might have data and dashboards everywhere, we'd have quality control analyze everything. We might go so far as to even script out everything we want people to say on the phone. But have you ever been on the phone where you can tell the person is reading a script to you, right? You know how painful that feels. That's the example of the call center where you've doubled down so much on the tactical, you've started to destroy the adaptive. You've probably had the reverse too, where you've called 3 people at the same company to talk to them and everyone gives you a different answer around what you're supposed to do, right? That's the call center where there's too much adaptive performance. They haven't invested enough in the tactical. What's interesting is that tactical and adaptive are opposites. The more you put pressure on one, the more you start to destroy the other. But great leaders are able to keep the two in balance. Now, this framework was so revealing because it unpacked for us that you could motivate people almost any way you want to get the tactical performance. But there's only one way to get both the tactical and the adaptive. It came down to this really simple truth that why we work determines how well we work. It turns out that there's a spectrum of reasons why people do anything, building off of 50 years of academic research started by Richard Ryan and Edward Deasy at the University of Rochester, and in experiments with real-life companies today. What we've learned is that when you're working, you might be working because of the work itself, the outcome of that work, like your values, your identity, and your beliefs, or something completely external to the work. So the spectrum ranges from the work itself to things completely external to the work. And we're going to combine these ingredients into the 6 motives of the motive spectrum. The first is play, like building on Gary's conversation this morning. When you're working simply because you love the work itself, you're in flow, you're in the zone, you feel curious, you're engaged, time flies. You simply love the activity. Anybody in the audience have hobbies that they love? Hobbies? Yep. Sir, what's your hobby?
Play music, saxophone.
You play the saxophone. Are you paid for playing the saxophone?
No, not at all.
Not at all. Are you famous for playing the saxophone?
Not at all.
Why'd you do it?
Well, I get immortal otherwise.
Right. We all experience play in our hobbies, and you play at work is when you're feeling that same level of engagement on the job. Teacher, for example, at play would be a teacher who loves coming up with new lesson plans or coming up with a new way to explain something to a student. Now, if we move a little bit to the right, we'll get to the second motive, which is purpose. And this is when you're working because you care about the outcome of your work. So for example, my mother is a teacher. She has lots of play, but she also finds deep purpose in teaching students how to read because it unlocks whole new worlds for students. That's the outcome of her work that she cares about. Next is potential. And this is when you're working for some second-order outcome of the work. It normally at work looks like a job that's a stepping stone. For example, our teacher may or may not have play or purpose, but she wants to be a principal one day. This job is enhancing her own potential in her career. Play, purpose, potential are all the direct motives because they're in some way directly connected to the work itself. But we're going to start moving into the indirect motives that are no longer connected to the work. So, show of hands, who's used guilt to try and get a loved one to do something? Yep, yeah, This one is emotional pressure. This is when you're using guilt, shame, FOMO to try and get somebody to do something. You're acting on their values and their identity to belief and applying that external force of that guilt to try and get them to act. For example, our teacher might say, you know, my father was a teacher, my grandfather was a teacher, I feel this really intense pressure to become a teacher one day. Next comes economic pressure. And this is when you use sticks or carrots. Somebody feels forced to do something to gain a reward or avoid a punishment. So for example, our teacher might say, you know, if I stick around for another year, my pension will kick in. That's economic pressure at work. And finally, the very last motive is inertia. And this is when you're showing up for work today because you showed up yesterday and you have no idea why, right? Your friend takes you to coffee on the weekend and says, why are you still in this job? And you say, I have no idea, right? It's shockingly common in the workplace. Now, there's two things to know about this spectrum. The first is that the direct motives increase adaptive performance, but the indirect motives destroy it. The second is that the spectrum ranges from the most powerful to the most destructive. So in my life, I'd always heard a lot about how important purpose was in finding work with meaning, and it's true. But in the data, finding play in your work is twice as important as purpose in creating adaptive performance, which was shocking to me. These motives behave so similarly in people around the world, across countries, across languages, that we can boil them down into one single concept of total motivation, or Tomo for short. High Tomo is when you've got lots of play, purpose, and potential, and very little emotional pressure, economic pressure, and inertia. And this is the state in which you'll get the most adaptive performance in an organization. Unfortunately, most companies are built in the reverse. So I'm going to do a little experiment today and ask what happens when I lower your Tomo. I'm going to ask somebody to come up. Does anybody here like puzzles, Sudokus, games? Nobody trusts me. Nobody's admitting it. All right, I'd like you to please reach under your seat. I'm going to ask one person to come up and do math on stage with me. You Post-it note under your seat? No, I'm kidding. There's nothing there. But you're relieved, right? You can imagine how horrible it would be to have to come up here and do math on stage in front of everybody else, right? What I'm doing is dramatically increasing your emotional pressure, and something that you might do for fun, like play a game or a Sudoku, suddenly becomes a terrifying experience. Now, that happens at work all the time. Right? Every single job has a component of tactical and adaptive performance. And when you're high Tomo with lots of play, purpose, and potential and very little pressure, you get high tactical and high adaptive. But when I ask somebody to come and do math on stage with me, which in longer talks I actually do, so you're very lucky, you get this distraction effect where your mind's literally in two places at once. Part of your mind's trying to solve the math puzzle, and part of your mind is trying to wonder why you even showed up today, right? How fast your neighbor is going, how scary it is. You get this distraction effect, you still get the tactical performance, but you start to lose the adaptive performance. People try really hard to solve the math problem. They'll tell you they're putting in tons of effort, but their ability to solve the problem creatively has started to go down. I can do worse. Have you ever had a friend at work who you just say is just checking the boxes, right? They do everything you ask them to do, but they never go above and beyond. That's the cancellation effect, where you're still getting the tactical things you asked for, but all the adaptive behavior, the problem-solving, creativity, helping your neighbor has been canceled out. They're not doing any of it. And that's what happened with our toddlers in the beginning. In the beginning, they're helping their neighbor just because it seems like the right thing to do, or it's fun, or it's interesting. And at the end, after the reward, they're like, not worth it to me anymore. That's the cancellation effect. However, we can do even worse. For this one, I want to go to one of my favorite stories from history. It takes place in the 1800s in India, in the city of Delhi. Now, the city was controlled at the time by a British government. And the British government, as they were walking to work each day, would occasionally run into these. I feel like we need our little rattles or something today. Although this is not a rattlesnake, this is a cobra. Very different from a little British garden snake, right? So the British government, realizing that they want to get rid of these cobras, decide that they're going to put a bounty on the head of every Cobra. So for every dead snake you bring in, you'll get a reward. They set up their Office of Dead Cobra Receiving, and snakes start coming in by the bucket load. It's a huge success until they realized that some people had started Cobra farms. They were farming the snakes for the bounty. And once they realized this, they of course canceled the bounty. It wasn't worth the farmers' time to kill the snakes, so they simply released them into the city of Delhi. And Delhi has more snakes at the end of this than it did in the beginning. Now, this is the Cobra effect, where you're still getting tactical performance you think. The dead Cobra dashboard is bright green, but you're not getting the adaptive performance, and you're getting a whole new type of performance, which is maladaptive performance. This is the cheating scandals that Volkswagen had, where they were cheating the EPA. This is the Wells Fargo opening of fake accounts. We see this in business all of the time. Cobra effects that are coming from environments where you've got very low play purpose potential, lots of emotional pressure and economic pressure. It's a predictable outcome. So now that you know as a leader that your tactical performance is only one part of what you need to look at, you've got to see both that plus the adaptive and maladaptive performance. The final question is, how do we build a whole culture that supports that? We wanted to test. This concept of total motivation was working in academic laboratories and small-scale experiments, but we wanted to see, was it working at the level of entire organizations? So we measured the total motivation of 50 major companies around the US, many of whom were famous for their cultures and their peers. We wanted to see, does Tomo affect outcomes that we really care about? Outcomes that require both the tactical and the adaptive performance. So one of our favorites is customer experience, because to get great customer experience, you have to be tactical and adaptive. So our first industry is famous for their customer experience. We've got the airline industry. So we've got customer satisfaction on the y-axis and Tomo on the x-axis. And I'm going to ask you to call out. Who do you think is the highest Tomo airline? Southwest. Who do you think is the lowest Tomo? United. Wow, look at that. All right, how'd you get here today? All right, let's take a look. The lowest Tomo airline? United. Good job. Next is American, Delta, and Southwest. Almost a straight line relationship between why people came to work and the experience their customers had. Despite the same airplanes, the same terminals, the same terrible food, they're able to create a meaningful difference in their employee experience. Our next industry, grocery stores. Who do you think is the highest Tomo grocer? Shout it out. I don't have Wegmans in my data set. Who else? Trader Joe's. Kroger. All right, let's take a look. Albertsons, Safeway, Kroger, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's. Yeah, good job. Again and again, industry after industry, this pattern held true. Now, we wanted to see, is it not just correlation, but is it causation? Can we go into an organization, change play, purpose, and potential, and change the outcomes? So we took over a bunch of retail stores for an organization to create a high Tomo pilot versus a set of similar stores that became our control. Now, this organization was full of people that were a huge mix of people. Some were incredibly bright, analytical, had always been successful their entire lives, and some people, this job was simply something they had strolled up to and got stuck in. Now, the first thing there were 4 things that we did for this group. The first, we reduced emotional and economic pressure by getting rid of their commissions. The second thing we did was boost their play by helping them craft micro experiments that they could run every single week in their store. Experiments in how they greeted a customer or how they introduced a new product. The third thing we did was increase their sense of purpose by helping them explain every policy and tool in a customer-centric way and adopt a purpose in their community that was greater than their own store. And the fourth thing we did was around potential. And this was help each person feel like they were getting deep skill building and development in their career. Then we looked at these outcomes. So productivity. This is increase in sales and decrease in cost. Our control group went up by 9% during this experiment. The pilot up by 20 in just 8 months. This organization had thought that culture was going to be a long-term payoff for them. A really, when I retire, I'll be proud of the achievement. But it turned into one of their most important short-term initiatives. Now, normally when productivity goes up, what you see is that customer satisfaction goes down because associates will start to use really high-pressure sales tactics, or you'll start to strip value out of it to reduce the cost. Sure enough, in the control, that went down by 4%, but in the pilot, the high Tomo group, up by 11. And finally, in cross-sales, this was the metric that caused Wells Fargo to start to open fake accounts. In the control, up by 2, in the pilot, up by 8. An incredible change in the profitability of these stores based on something that people hadn't really paid attention to before. And not only was it something that increased their profitability, but you had associates in these stores saying, this was the first time I feel like I'm really living to my true potential as a human being. So this experiment and many others have taught us that what we need to do is define culture far more broadly. To build a truly adaptive organization, we had to think of culture as everything that shapes why you work. Not just your mission, your values, your purpose, but anything that influences why you show up. And we were able to measure all the different systems in a company that do that and how much they influence your Tomo. So as a sneak peek, it included not only your identity, your purpose, and your community, but also how you're structured. Your role design was actually the biggest influencer of your Tomo. How the talent system worked, deep skill building as opposed to ratings or rankings or commissions. How your governance worked, your planning worked, how your team routines, did you have agile adaptive teams? And finally, how you interact with others. Leadership, not just for those at the top of the hierarchy, but for every associate. These were the things that had the biggest influence on how your people experienced their work and their adaptive performance. So, where we've been today. The first is that you now know as a leader that performance requires both the tactical and the adaptive. When you're sitting in your leadership team meetings, how are you talking about the adaptive? How are you making sure you don't have Cobra farms in your tactical metrics? Next, the way to get there is to create a high Tomo environment, an environment filled with play and purpose and potential, and not the emotional pressure, economic pressure, or inertia. And finally, to create a high Tomo environment, it takes more than simply not being a jerk, right? There's this whole ecosystem that shapes why your people come in to work every day. The flip side of that is that as a leader, you've got far more tools than your personality to make a great work experience for your associates. So to conclude today, if I were going to recommend doing 3 things to help you move forward, the first would be to learn more. To create learning moments with your organization where you understand what is total motivation, how do we build it, understand all the different pieces of an ecosystem that affect it. The second is to measure your total motivation. So at primetoperform.com, there's a survey that you can take. It'll go to your teammates, it'll come back to you anonymized and your teammates anonymized with a discussion guide. And it is incredibly powerful to learn where your colleagues find play. Thankfully, many of them will find play in areas you don't. So suddenly you can shift the work around and everybody ends up a lot happier. And finally, feel free to reach out for more tools and resources and questions. But it's been an honor to be here today. Thank you very much.